August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, 7:31 a.m. Private First Class Daichi Shinohara adjusted the strap of his Type 38 Arisaka rifle and stepped out of the barracks into a strange and perfect silence. There were no bombers in the sky, no sirens, no children crying. Even the wind that usually rustled the cloth banners hanging outside the garrison headquarters had died. His boots made dull thuds against the packed dirt path as he walked toward the eastern perimeter, where the junior sentries rotated through observation duty. He squinted at the rising sun cresting over the Hiroshima Prefectural Commercial Exhibition Hall. The city looked untouched, which made no sense. They'd been warned days ago that American bombers had begun to spare certain cities, Kyoto, Kokura, Hiroshima, from the kind of destruction that had flattened Tokyo. No one knew why. Rumors spread. Perhaps the emperor had struck a secret peace. Perhaps the Americans were preparing a landing. But Daichi had seen enough to distrust good news. The silence was not peace. It was a setup. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. A faint tremor passed under his boots. He thought it was nothing, maybe just nerves, until the pigeons rose from the rooftops in a sudden, violent wave. Then he saw it. A silver dot high in the sky, small, too small to be a squadron. It glinted against the morning sun. No sirens blared, no one had noticed it yet. He stepped forward, squinting, eyes straining. A lone bomber. Daichi muttered aloud to no one, "Why send one?" That's when the light swallowed him. There was no sound, not at first. Just a brilliance, white, absolute, obliterating. It did not shine. It consumed. It surged from the heavens like a tidal wave of light, a sun blooming where no sun should exist. Daichi's world became silhouette. Every building, every tree, every shadow around him vanished into brightness. His body seized as the heat struck, not like fire, but like being slammed by the breath of a god. His cigarette incinerated midair. His uniform caught, then peeled from his skin. Time fractured. There was no scream, just a flash. And then sound. A detonation so massive it arrived late, like thunder chasing lightning. The sky cracked open with a roar that bent the mountains. The shockwave lifted Daichi from the earth. He didn't remember hitting the ground. He woke in silence again. Only it wasn't silence, it was deafness. His ears rang with a high tone, steady, pure, painful. The barracks were gone. The garrison headquarters was gone. The trees were gone. The exhibition hall, the one building he had used to orient himself in the city, stood like a skeleton, roof sheared away, the dome split and flaming. Daichi's eyes watered as he tried to breathe. Dust coated his tongue. Blood dripped from both nostrils. He staggered to his feet. His Arisaka rifle, fused and warped, lay half buried in the dirt behind him. Bodies smoldered. Some were not whole. Some were outlines of perfect shadows burned into concrete. A man on a bicycle had become a ghost. He stumbled forward. His boots crushed glass, bone, fire. He passed a soldier crawling, skin hanging in ribbons, whispering nonsense. Another man stood screaming at the sun, eyeballs gone. None of this was war. War was loud. War was bullets and tanks and screaming and firebombs and buildings collapsing. This was something else. He had watched the sky over Hiroshima and witnessed the end of something. He moved in a daze, deeper into the heart of what had once been the city. Streets he had walked just yesterday were now burned corridors between skeletal walls. Every step closer to the blast center brought more horror. Glass melted into stone, ceramic tiles seared together, children clinging to corpses thinking they were still warm. The survivors didn't speak. They wandered, moaning, blind. A young girl clutched a rice bowl fused to her hands. A mother tried to lift her son from a boiling stream, not realizing he was already gone. Daichi walked until his knees buckled. He collapsed near a fountain that no longer flowed, beside a child with eyes too wide and too dry. For hours he remained there, breathing, listening to the endless whine in his skull, watching the ash fall like snow. That night, as fires ringed the crater where Hiroshima had been, Daichi stared at the sky. No American planes returned, no tanks rolled in, no invasion. Just silence. As if one single bomb had done what entire fleets of bombers could not. He whispered to himself, lips cracked and bleeding, "This is not war anymore." There was no countermeasure, no retaliation, no rifle, no courage, no kamikaze, no emperor's decree could match this. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a declaration. The rules had changed. He felt something deeper than fear, something that hollowed him out. This was the moment the world shifted under his feet, and he had lived to see it. The morning after the blast, the fires were still burning. There were no working clocks left near the hypocenter, but Daichi Shinohara guessed it was nearly 8 a.m., 24 hours since the light swallowed the city. The sky was a pale yellow-gray, full of low smoke, carrying the stench of burned metal, flesh, and something else, something synthetic, bitter, radioactive, though he had no name for it. He stood on what used to be the roof of the Chugoku Military Police Headquarters. Now it was a flat plain of glassy rubble. Twisted girders jutted from the ground like the bones of an ancient creature. Daichi had slept for less than an hour. His body was coated in ash. His skin stung from hundreds of tiny cuts. His boots were melted at the heels. He no longer knew what unit he belonged to, what orders he had, or if there was even a chain of command left. He hadn't seen a senior officer since yesterday. What he had seen were eyes, thousands of them, burned open, seared shut, wide and unblinking. He had seen a man with no jaw helping a woman with no legs crawl through the dust. He had seen children trying to drink from the Kaio River while their skin peeled off like wet cloth. At first, they had thought it was a new type of incendiary bomb, or perhaps a terrible accident, a munitions cache hit by a freak lightning strike. But no conventional explanation fit what they had witnessed. The shockwave had been too fast, the flash too bright, the silence too vast. And then there was the heat. No firebombing could do that, not to metal, not to people. He looked to the west, where the hills curved like sleeping giants around the basin of Hiroshima. The trees there were blackened silhouettes. Beyond them, to the northwest, the sky was oddly clearer, as if the atmosphere itself had been punched open. Something had fallen from the sky, something worse than any bomb. Daichi didn't need orders to know what to do. He began walking alone toward the riverbank. They were pulling the corpses out by hand now. Most of the bridges were gone, either collapsed into the water or shattered into twisted rebar and broken stone. Daichi helped an old man, shirtless and bleeding, carry a child's body across the shallows. They didn't speak. The civilians who had survived the initial blast were in a kind of purgatory. Their clothes had been vaporized. Their hair was singed off. Their skin hung from their arms and backs in sheets, revealing raw muscle. Many wandered naked, their voices low, repeating names of loved ones who would never answer. One woman sat on the riverbank, washing her hands obsessively, though they were barely recognizable. Fingers fused together, skin sloughing off in pink ribbons. Daichi didn't know what to say to her. He only kept moving. Near the eastern edge of the city, where some wooden structures had been shielded by hills, he found others, a group of police officers, a medic, a young nurse wrapped in bloodied cloth. They looked at him without salute or question. No rank mattered now. "Do you know what happened?" the nurse asked, voice hoarse. Daichi opened his mouth, then closed it. He shook his head slowly. One of the officers said, "The Americans, it was a new weapon." "What kind?" Daichi asked. No one answered. Later that afternoon, they found a still-living communications technician in a half-collapsed radio outpost. His leg was crushed under debris, and he was dying of internal bleeding, but he had lived long enough to pass on what little he had heard. "There was only one plane," he whispered. "A B-29, not a squadron, just one." "What did it drop?" "A single bomb," the man croaked. "It wasn't like the others, it did everything." And then he went still. Daichai stared at the man's face. He didn't understand the words, not really, but his body went cold. A single bomb. Everything. By nightfall, the sky above Hiroshima turned a strange shade of violet. Ash drifted on the wind like black snow. The fires no longer burned high, they smoldered deep in the bones of buildings, in the earth itself. An eerie glow pulsed faintly from the ground near the hypocenter. Daichai didn't dare go closer. There were rumors now. People were whispering phrases like "new weapon," "one bomb," "city gone in 1 second." Someone said it was lightning harnessed by the Americans. Another said it was a chemical gas that ignited the air itself. A third said it was not man-made at all, that it came from something divine. Daichai knew better. He had seen the bomber, a silver dot, small, almost playful in the morning sky. He had looked at it with human eyes. Whatever had happened, it came from man. That made it worse. 2 days later, on August 8th, he found a working shortwave radio in a half-demolished truck on the city's edge. After hours of rewiring and adjusting the antenna, he caught the tail end of an American broadcast in broken Japanese. The weapon used was an atomic bomb. The target was Hiroshima. The United States has harnessed nuclear energy to shorten the war and save lives. One bomb, equal to 20,000 tons of TNT. The voice cut in and out, but Daichai heard enough. He sat down in the grass beside the truck, staring at the silent city. His lips trembled. He tried to understand the scale, 20,000 tons. He tried to imagine it as TNT, as shells, as firebombs. But the numbers meant nothing. They couldn't capture what he had seen. He looked back toward the crater. A single plane. A single bomb. An entire city gone. In Tokyo, the emperor's advisors debated surrender for the first time in earnest. But in Hiroshima, there was no debate. They had already surrendered. There were no defenses left, no garrison, no command structure, no hope. Only ash, silence, and shadows burned into walls. The soldiers who survived knew it. Daichai spoke with another private who had watched from the northern ridge. The man said, "We never heard it coming. There was no air raid siren, no resistance, just light." They had trained for years to fight the Americans with rifles, with machine guns, with tanks. They had rehearsed beach defenses, urban ambushes, banzai charges. None of it mattered. Because this wasn't a war that could be fought. It was a switch flipped from the sky that decided who lived and who vanished. Daichai whispered, "This is the end of our age." He spent the night walking through what remained of Hindori Street. The street signs were warped. Electric wires hung like vines. He passed a train car bent in half like paper, windows melted. Inside there were no passengers, just streaks on the metal walls where the heat had left only shadows. He stepped over the remains of a school, blackened books, charred desks, a chalkboard turned to slag. And then he saw it. In the dirt, half buried, an old toy, a wooden soldier untouched. He picked it up with shaking fingers. It had been spared by some miracle of blast and fire. A symbol of another war, another time, a child's fantasy of honor, rifles, helmets, and flags. He turned it over once, then let it fall. By the morning of August 9th, news arrived by word of mouth. Another bomb had been dropped. Nagasaki. Another city gone. Daichai sat beside the riverbank staring at his reflection. The ash clung to his skin. His uniform was ruined. His hands were blistered and shaking. He watched as the water carried the bodies past him. Dozens, hundreds, some curled into themselves, others reaching upward in their final moment. He did not cry. He just watched. because something had died inside him, something older than pride, deeper than fear. It was the belief that men shaped the battlefield. He now knew better. The battlefield had become something else, and Hiroshima was only the beginning. The air changed after Nagasaki. Not just in temperature or wind, but in weight. A heaviness settled across the country. It wasn't fear. Fear had been with them for years in bomb shelters, in ration lines, in whispered prayers as B-29s passed overhead. This was something else. It was the beginning of understanding, and the unbearable weight that came with it. Daichi Shinohara returned to the hills above Hiroshima 3 days after the second bomb. He was one of the few soldiers still in uniform. His rank didn't matter anymore. He wore it like a habit, not a command. He walked through the outer farmlands where the rice paddies had been singed but spared the full fury. The old farmers still worked the fields in silence, but their hands shook when they stooped to gather tools. Their eyes never lifted to the sky. Everyone had begun to fear the sky now. For months they had feared bombers. Then they had feared the sudden silence that preceded firebombings. Now they feared something quieter, more precise, the silence that followed a single dot in the sky. One plane. One flash. Everything gone. At a small medical post built from scavenged planks and rice straw, Daichi helped carry a burned girl to the floor where the other patients lay. She was too light. Her skin peeled when touched. Her mother had already died the day before, her body bloated and leaking yellow fluid from every pore. The doctors didn't understand it. The burns weren't normal. They came without flames. Blisters formed days after the blast on people who had not been close to the hypocenter. Hair fell out in handfuls. Gums bled. Vomiting wouldn't stop. They called it the black sickness. Some thought it was poison gas. Others said it was infection. But Daichi had seen the pattern. It had nothing to do with touch or flame or open wounds. It came from the air. From the very particles that once carried light and warmth and breath. He sat with the girl through the night. Her eyes were still open, but they no longer saw. She died before sunrise, barely making a sound. He carried her body to the edge of the paddy field and helped bury her with a dozen others. No name, no marker, just silence. On August 11th, Daichi finally received orders, or what passed for them. A young runner from Hiroshima Prefecture's Reserve Command found him on the northern ridge. The boy's shoes were too big, and his hands were blistered from sun exposure. He delivered the message without ceremony. Return to Kure, all survivors to regroup, no offensive operations, defensive posture only. That was it, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the bomb, not even the word atomic, just instructions to fall back, to wait. Daichi burned the message once the boy had gone. He knew what it meant. The army didn't know what to do. No one did. At Kure, the naval port buzzed with ghostly movement. Crews hauled rusted steel across docks now half abandoned. Ships had stopped launching. Submarines had stopped diving. The only real sound was the wind across warehouses and the occasional footfall of soldiers who no longer knew where to go. Daichi was given a cot in a storage shed once used for munitions. His commanding officer, a man he hadn't seen in nearly a year, arrived 3 hours later and stared at him as if trying to remember his name. "You survived," the officer said, more surprised than relieved. "I was in Hiroshima," Daichi replied. The officer flinched slightly. "You saw it." "I saw the sky." That was all he said. That was all he needed to say. Over the next 2 days, rumors became facts. The Americans had dropped 2 special bombs. Only 2, only one per city. They weren't like normal bombs. They didn't rely on fire or shrapnel. They were something new. Some officers whispered words like uranium and atom splitting. They said it in tones usually reserved for religious curses. It wasn't military science. It was something deeper. It felt stolen from the universe. One captain, drunk and bitter, said, "We built our empire with steel and blade. They ended it with sunlight." No one corrected him. On August 14th, the radios across Kure crackled with the sound of a message none of them had ever imagined hearing. It was the Emperor. His voice was faint, formal, recorded. He did not say surrender. He did not say defeat. But he said enough. The war was over. Daichai stood among dozens of soldiers on the dock that evening. Some wept. Others stared at the sea. The sun dipped behind the islands, and for a moment the water glowed gold. No cheers, no speeches, just stillness. One soldier, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, asked Daichai, "What do we do now?" Daichai didn't answer. He just looked upward at the cloudless, perfect sky. And for the first time in weeks, he did not feel awe or hatred or even fear. He felt small. In Tokyo, ministers signed the papers. On warships, American officers received the Japanese emissaries with crisp salutes and stony faces. In America, people danced in the streets, kissed strangers, wept with joy. But in Hiroshima, the ash still drifted through alleyways. In Nagasaki, mothers still searched for children. And in Kure, Daichai stood in a supply warehouse, polishing the only object he had brought back from the blast. It wasn't his rifle, that had melted. It wasn't his uniform, that had burned. It was a small stone, fused with glass, that he had found near the center of the destruction. He didn't know why he had taken it, maybe to prove it had all been real, maybe to remember. He held it in his hand now, feeling the cold weight of it. It was smooth on one side, jagged on the other like the world itself. He turned it slowly, watching how it caught the light. And then he dropped it into the sea. The first Americans Daichai saw wore no weapons. It was September 1945. The heat hadn't broken, but the cicadas had. The insects had vanished with the fires, as if nature itself was afraid to speak over what had happened. Daichai was sweeping the debris outside a requisitioned hospital in Kure when they arrived, two soldiers, not much older than him, carrying cameras and notebooks. They did not shout orders or spit insults. They simply looked. One of them raised his camera and took a photo of the hospital's shell-shock patients lying on straw mats. Daichai stepped between them. The American didn't speak Japanese. He lowered his camera, tilted his head, and said quietly, "Okay." Then he nodded and walked away. Daichai stood there for a long time. It was the first time he realized the war was truly over, not because Japan had surrendered, but because the Americans didn't look like conquerors. They looked like men who had seen the future and didn't know what to do with it. Rumors traveled faster now. There were no censors, no Kempeitai agents to choke off whispers, and so the truth spilled everywhere from Tokyo to the smallest fishing village. The Americans had developed a weapon that split atoms, that harnessed the sun, that reduced cities to dust in a single breath. And they had more of them. Daichai heard it first from a nurse. They say they can destroy 10 cities at once, maybe more. Then from a merchant. Kyoto was spared because they wanted to study it afterward. And then from an old veteran who spat in the street and said, "This is not surrender, it's extinction delayed." No one argued with him. Daichai saw his first American Jeep on September 8th. It rolled slowly through the outskirts of Hiroshima, flanked by soldiers who looked more tired than proud. Their faces were sunburned, their eyes behind sunglasses unreadable. One soldier pointed to the exhibition hall, what was left of it, and another took a photo. They spoke quietly. Then they moved on. Daichai watched them from a second-floor window of what used to be a schoolhouse. He expected rage, humiliation, something burning in his chest. Instead, he felt nothing. He wasn't watching victors. He was watching witnesses. and he understood that they, too, were afraid of what they had done. In late September, American doctors arrived to assist with the radiation cases. They set up tents and interviewed survivors. They took blood. They recorded symptoms. They sketched lesions and drew diagrams. They never said the word guilt. Only data. Daichai worked as a translator for a few days. It was voluntary, nothing was compulsory anymore. The Americans asked him to repeat simple questions. Where were you standing? Did you see the flash? How long before you lost consciousness? He translated each one without emotion, without pause. Until they asked a woman who had lost her entire family, "Did you see the plane?" She nodded. "It was beautiful, like a silver bird. I thought maybe it was here to help." Daichai couldn't bring himself to repeat that in English. He walked out of the tent and vomited into the grass. In October, he returned to the city center for the first time since the first week. It was different now. The fires were gone. The streets had been cleared enough to walk, but the silence had deepened. Nature had not returned. There were no birds, no dogs, no green, just the crunch of glass and grit underfoot. At the hypocenter, a sign had been erected by an American photographer. It read Ground Zero. Daichai stood there for an hour. He tried to imagine the moment of detonation, not as he had lived it but from above, from the sky. A silent bomber, a hatch opening, a single object falling. And then light. So much light that it devoured sound, form, identity. He wondered what the American in the bomber had felt. Was it power, regret, or simply distance? Did he see the fire below? Did he hear the scream that came after? Daichai never learned the name of the plane. He never wanted to. That winter the snow came late. When it did, it fell over the ruins like ash in reverse, white flakes on blackened steel, a strange peace. Daichai walked the riverbank again. The water had returned to its old course, but its banks were lined with makeshift graves. Families came quietly, setting down small offerings, paper cranes, bits of fruit, old photos still wrapped in ribbon. He saw one woman tying a child's shoe, gently, to the remains of a fence post. He didn't ask whose it was. He only bowed. She bowed back. That was all there was now, grief and silence, shared but unspoken. By December, Daichai no longer wore his uniform. He had kept the jacket for weeks after the surrender as if it offered structure. But eventually, it felt like a costume, something dead. He found work helping rebuild the roads outside Fukuyama, shoveling debris, laying stone, hauling timber. No one asked if he had fought. No one cared. The questions had changed. Do you have food? Is your family alive? Where were you when the sky opened? These were the new questions, the only ones that mattered. One evening, in a bar carved into the basement of a building that had somehow survived, Daichai sat beside a young man in civilian clothes. The man looked over and asked, "Did you fight?" Daichai said, "Yes." The man took a sip of warm sake, then said, "I never got the chance. I trained, but the war ended before I could ship out." He smiled faintly, as if uncertain whether to feel lucky or ashamed. Daichai stared at the table, then said, "You didn't miss war. You missed a world that could still make sense." The man blinked. "What do you mean?" Daichai answered without looking up. "I mean you missed a war that still had rules." In January, Daichai returned to Hiroshima one last time. He found the old shrine near the eastern edge, mostly intact. Its roof had collapsed, but the stone torii still stood. He stepped through the gate, careful not to disturb the broken tiles. Inside the shrine's remains, he found a single statue still upright, a weathered image of a lion dog, its mouth open mid-snarl, defiant. He sat across from it in the snow. He did not pray. He no longer believed in the same gods, not after what he'd seen, but he stayed there until nightfall. Then he whispered, We didn't lose a war. He touched the earth. We lost the world we knew. Years passed and the world moved forward. But Hiroshima never moved on. Daichi Shinohara worked as a postal clerk in Fukuyama after the war. He sorted letters by hand in a building with patched windows, wore the same jacket every day and spoke little. His neighbors didn't ask questions. His hands were steady, his silence dependable. He never told them what he had seen. He never told them that he had watched the light come down from the sky. He never said he had looked directly at the center of the end of the world. When schoolchildren asked him what the war had been like, he told them it was confusing. When they asked him if he'd fought Americans, he said he never got close enough. When they asked if Japan had lost, he said it had ended. He never said the word Hiroshima. Not once. One morning in August 1949, Daichi returned. He took the train in silence. The city had changed again, not rebuilt, not restored, but layered. Like a scar that grows over itself, raw then smooth, then tough. Where the crater had been, there were parks now, gardens, bicycles. The new buildings were concrete, angular, modern. The charred wooden frames of the past were gone, so were most of the people he had known. But the silence still lived in certain corners, in certain alleys, in the shadows of bridges that had been rebuilt too quickly, too cleanly. He walked until he reached the same place, the very same place where he had stood on August 6, 1945. Near what was once the military barracks, where he had first seen the silver speck in the sky. He looked up again. Nothing, just clouds. A child ran past, chasing a ball. A mother called after him in laughter. The smell of fish and soy rose from a distant kitchen. The world had moved on. Daichi hadn't. In 1951, American scientists came to speak with him. They had found records, partial ones, of surviving soldiers near the hypocenter. They wanted to ask questions. What had he seen? How far had he been from ground zero? What did the sky look like? He didn't answer, not directly. He said only, "It was a kind of silence we don't have words for." They asked if he had heard the plane. No. The bomb. No. They asked if he blamed America. He looked at them for a long time and said, "Do you know how many people I watched die before that bomb?" One of them said, "But this was different." "Yes," Daichi replied, "because it told the truth, that we were never in control." He spent the next years keeping to himself. He watched Japan change faster than anyone could imagine. The streets flooded with cars. Neon signs replaced the old paper lanterns. Radios turned into televisions. He read about satellites, about hydrogen bombs, about Americans dropping men onto the moon. The world had swallowed Hiroshima, then moved beyond it. But he hadn't. He still saw shadows burned into walls, still heard the ringing in his ears, still dreamed of a silver dot in the sky suspended in light. He still couldn't look at sunlight on a calm day without flinching. In 1960, he visited the Peace Memorial Museum, once. He walked through the exhibits in silence, saw the glass bottles melted into puddles, the twisted tricycle of a child who had died instantly, the fingernails of a girl who kept growing hers even after her skin had peeled away. He stood before a photograph taken moments after the detonation, the cloud rising over the city, a stalk of ash curling into the sky like judgment. He said nothing. He left without signing the guest book. No one asked him to speak, and he would not have if they had. Because what he had witnessed wasn't something to describe. It was something that simply was. A moment when light tore through the air and burned the meaning out of everything. He had survived it, others had not. And the burden of surviving something that should not exist, that was the silence he carried. In 1971, Daichi Shinohara died quietly in his sleep, alone, in a modest apartment overlooking a small park. No family, no obituary, just a quiet funeral arranged by a neighbor. In a drawer beside his bed, they found a small wooden box. Inside was a single polished stone, smooth on one side, jagged on the other, fused with glass. A piece of Hiroshima. There was no note, just a folded sheet of paper, aged and worn, on which he had written one line in careful brush strokes. I was there when the sky changed.